Hi everybody, welcome to my YouTube channel Dr. Srinivas Medical Concepts and my FB page Dr. Srinivas Concepts. This is Dr. Srinivas, neurologist from Andhra Pradesh, India. I'm also the medical author of the book Focused Neurology. Today we are going to talk about neurology history taking, where is the lesion, the anatomic diagnosis. It's going to be very important and interesting for MBBS students, and I hope it will be useful for also postgraduate students and for super specialty students as a kind of review. So neurology history taking is going to be a very important and probably the first interaction between the doctor and the student. So in neurology, we give importance to two particular points. Where is the lesion, the anatomic diagnosis, and what is the lesion, the etiologic diagnosis. So today we'll talk about where is the lesion, the anatomic diagnosis. But before I dwell into the topic, we need to understand one important point, the Bayes theorem. The Bayes theorem. Accordingly, the rare manifestations of common disease are commoner than the common manifestations of the rare diseases. So the rare manifestations of the common disease are commoner than the common manifestations of the rare disease. What does this indicate? The common diseases are common. So always when you approach a person with a neurological disease, for that matter any disorder, you have to always think of the common disorders. Common disorders are common. Okay. Neurological history, where is the lesion, the anatomic diagnosis. Here we go. So we would like to know where in the nervous system the lesion is. Where is the lesion? So it could be anywhere in these 15 areas. It could be in the cerebral cortex, it could be in the brainstem, it could be in the cerebellum, or the spinal cord could be involved, or the neuronopathy, that is the anterior horn cells or the dorsal root ganglia can be involved, or it could be in the radicals, the dorsal root or the ventral root, or it could be in the plexus. It could be in the peripheral nerve, or it could be in the neuromuscular junction or the muscle myopathy, or it could be multifocal. It could be in many places. I'll tell a few examples of that. It could be in the meninges causing meningeal irritation. It could be in the ventricles causing raised intracranial tension or just a normal pressure hydrocephalus. The neurology and the skin, especially the skin, gets commonly involved in neurological disorders. That's why we have neurocutaneous markers. So it could be in the skin along with the nervous system, and the skull and spine also could get involved. The anencephaly, the spina bifida, or the scoliosis, kyphosis, and the high arched foot. These are common in neurological disorders, especially the long-standing chronic neuropathies. I'll talk about it when I come to neurology and the skull and spine. Right. So there are so many places where a neurological lesion could be. So now we'll go step by step. The few important questions we need to ask, the pertinent examination we need to make to find out where the neurological lesion is. Right? Right. First is cerebral cortex. Before we approach a person with neurological disorder and would like to know whether cerebral cortex is involved or not, we need to know the handedness of the patient. The handedness of the patient. In right-handed persons, more than 90% of the time, the left side is dominant, but 10% may be on the right side. So more than 90% of the right-handers, the left cortex is dominant. What is dominant cortex? Dominant cortex is that cortex where the speech centers are situated. So in more than 90% of the right-handers, the speech centers are situated on the left side of the cortex, and therefore we call the left cortex as the dominant cortex, right? So in cerebral cortex, if the left side is the dominant cortex, the speech centers are situated there. Obviously, you'll have speech disorders. There could be aphasia, speech disorder, alexia, difficulty in reading, agraphia, difficulty in writing, or acalculia, difficulty in calculation. So if these aspects of speech are affected, then it is in the left side of the cortex, that is the dominant cortex. Then the question comes, is there no speech disorder which affects the non-dominant cortex? Yes. There is one component of the speech disorder which affects the non-dominant cortex, the right side cortex, and that is called prosody. What is prosody? Prosody is the intonation or the melody of the speech. For example, if I see a friend after a long time, 10 years, how will be my reaction be? I'll say, oh my friend, you have come, I'm very happy. So there's an emotional aspect, intonation, prosody. So that is there in the non-dominant cortex, right side of the cortex. So if non-dominant cortex gets affected, the prosody gets affected, and they'll have a flat speech without any emotional component to it. So they would say, hi my friend, how are you? You have come after 10 years, I'm very happy. So a monotonous, there will not be inflections, intonation, melody. So this is known as prosody, that will be absent on the right side of the cortex. And then, because the right side of the cortex controls both the right and the left extrapersonal space, whereas the left controls only the right extrapersonal space. So if the left side of the cortex is affected, the right extrapersonal space is affected, but that is compensated by the intact right parietal lobe, which controls both right and left. So left-sided cortex does not produce right hemineglect. But if right-sided cortex gets affected, both the right and the left extrapersonal space is affected, but the right extrapersonal space is compensated by the intact left parietal lobe. There is no compensation on the left side. So the right-sided lesions will produce left hemineglect. So you can ask in the history, when the person wears his dress, whether he wears only on one side, right side, and forgets the left side. When male may shave, they shave only on the right side, they do not shave on the left side. At the bedside, you can test by giving a clock with 12 numbers and ask him to put all 12 numbers on the clock. A normal person will put 6 numbers on the right side and 6 numbers on the left side. But person who has got a right parietal lobe lesion and left hemineglect will put all the 12 numbers on the right side and will neglect the left side. So a simple bedside test to find out left hemineglect is the clock test at the bedside. So they'll have left hemineglect. If the dominant cortex gets affected, they'll have apraxias, ideational, ideomotor, or limb kinetic apraxia. Apraxia is inability to perform a learned motor act despite motor, sensory, comprehension, coordination being intact. You have ideational apraxia, you have ideomotor apraxia, and limb kinetic apraxia. The parietal lobe is responsible for planning, and the frontal lobe is responsible for actual execution of the movement. So if parietal lobe gets affected, the planning gets affected. They cannot imagine and then perform and then do a particular act. For example, you ask them to imagine and brush their teeth. They can't. But if you give a real lifetime object, they can brush their teeth. So this is known as ideomotor apraxia. In ideomotor apraxia, parietal lobe and parietal frontal connection, parietal lobe gets affected. So planning gets affected, but frontal lobe is intact, the execution is intact. So here the activities of daily living are not impaired. That is ideomotor apraxia. Fortunately, that is the commonest apraxia. In ideational apraxia, the frontal lobe itself is affected. So the actual execution of the movement gets affected. So they cannot perform any movement in a sequential manner. In bits and pieces they perform, but they cannot perform in a sequential and a logical, meaningful manner when they are given a real lifetime object. So if you ask them to give a pen and write, they may take the pen, but instead of writing with the writing end, they may write with the other end. This is ideation apraxia. Here activities of daily living are impaired. So here it is the frontal lobe or paretofrontal connections which get affected. So these apraxias, ideational, idiomotor, limb kinetic, where they have difficulty in performing with the hands, are indicative of a left-sided cortex, that is the dominant cortex. In right-sided cortex also you have apraxias, that is dressing apraxia or a constructional apraxias. They are not more of apraxias. They have difficulty in performing a very delicate act. So the dressing apraxia and constructional apraxias are seen in the non-dominant cortex, whereas other real apraxias, that is ideational apraxia, idiomotor apraxia or limb kinetic apraxia, are seen in the dominant cortex. So if both gets affected, it could be left or right. What will be the manifestations? They'll have visual disturbances, homonymous hemianopia and gaze preference. For example, frontal eye fields area number 8 will push the eyes to the opposite side, and therefore when the frontal cortex gets affected, it cannot push the eyes to the opposite side. So gaze preference will be to one side and hemiplegia will be on the opposite side. So in left frontal lobe lesions, eyes will be looking to left side and hemiplegia will be on the opposite side. So if you see gaze preference and hemiplegia, it's a frontal lobe cortex. And they'll have homonymous hemianopia if the cortex gets affected. For example, if the internal capsule gets affected, anterior choroidal artery of the internal carotid artery affecting the posteriormost part of the internal capsule, they'll have hemiplegia, hemianesthesia and homonymous hemianopia because visual radiations goes just underneath the internal capsule. Or if the temporal lobe and parietal lobe or the occipital lobe gets affected, they'll have homonymous hemianopia. If it is temporal lobe, the superior part gets affected. If it is parietal lobe, the inferior part gets affected. If it is occipital lobe, opposite side homonymous hemianopia will be there, but with macula sparing. So with just homonymous hemianopia, you can place the lesion whether it is temporal lobe, parietal lobe or occipital lobe, or if it is internal capsule, you have hemiplegia, hemesthesia and homonymous hemianopia. Right. Then motor. You can have motor involvement, weakness. Hemiplegia and hemesthesia occurring together, it is usually a cortical lesion. If hemiplegia is seen, a pure hemiplegia or a pure hemisensory stroke is seen, the lesion will be the internal capsule. Why? In internal capsule, the motor supply, the motor cortex and the sensory areas are supplied by different arteries. Whereas in the cerebral cortex, the motor area and the sensory area are supplied by the same artery, middle cerebral artery. So when the hemiplegia and hemesthesia are occurring together, it could be in the cortex or in the internal capsule where the lenticulostriate arteries of the middle cerebral artery supply. But if there is pure hemiplegia or pure hemesthesia, the lesion has to be only in the internal capsule because they are supplied by different areas. But if they are conjoined together, it could be anywhere in the internal capsule or the cortex. But if they are separate, pure hemiplegia or pure hemesthesia, it has to be in the internal capsule. And then if the leg area is affected more than the hand area, that means the lesion is in the medial part of the frontal lobe, anterior cerebral artery is affected. If the hand area is affected more than the leg area, that means it is a middle cerebral artery distribution. So with weakness, whether it's a dense hemiplegia or leg more than hand or hand more than the leg, you can place the lesion. Where it is affected. The sensory. We all know all the primary sensations reach up to the level of thalamus, but from the thalamus to the post-central gyrus, that is the parietal cortex, if there is a lesion there, then only the cortical sensations are affected. That is tactile localization, 2-point discrimination, graphesthesia, stereognosis or barognosis. If only the cortical sensations are affected, that means the parietal cortex is affected. All the basic sensations are affected up to the level of thalamus. And then they can have other findings also. A person may have seizures, a person may have agnosias. So seizures and agnosias, it has to be in the cortex. For example, person has got auditory agnosia. What is agnosia? Agnosia means the peripheral system perceiving the particular sensation is intact, but still they are not able to appreciate the sensation because it's a central processing disorder. For example, person's auditory apparatus is intact, he is not able to hear, that means the lesion is the temporal lobe. A person is able to see well, that means his visual apparatus is there, but he is not able to interpret the meaning of what he has seen. That means again it is occipital lobe, visual agnosias. The vision on the right side goes to the left occipital cortex and the vision on the left side goes to the right occipital cortex. So if left side there's a visual loss, that means if right side visual loss is there, that means left occipital cortex is there. If left side visual cortex is there, that means right occipital cortex is affected. And one more interesting point about the visual disturbance and aphasia is that whatever I see on the right side, the visual form, if I want to convert it into a language form, it is easy when I look to the right, because the right sided vision goes to my left occipital cortex. My speech centers are also on the left side, so it accesses easily. So whatever I see on the right, to convert it into a language form is very easy. But it may be slightly delayed whenever I look at the left side and want to convert it into a language form, because whatever I see on the left side goes to my right occipital cortex, but my language centers are there. It has to traverse the corpus callosum, and then has to get access to the language areas on the left side. So it may take slightly a longer time, and if there's a lesion in the corpus callosum, it may be difficult altogether. So anything I see on the right side, since my left visual cortex persists, it is easy to convert into a language form, because my language areas is also on the same side, that is on the left. So speech agnosias or seizures, again if they are present, they are characteristic of a cortex lesion. Brainstem. Then how do you know whether the brainstem is affected? Where the lesion, where it is, midbrain, pons or medulla oblongata? The brainstem disorders produce a characteristic crossed paralysis, ipsilateral cranial nerve palsy and contralateral hemiplegia. So the third and fourth nerves are there in the midbrain, 5, 6, 7, 8 are there in the pons, 9, 10, 11, 12 are there in the medulla oblongata. So if the third nerve and fourth nerve cranial palsies are there on one side and hemiplegia is on the opposite side, it's a midbrain lesion. If 5, 6, 7, 8 cranial nerves are affected on one side, example left side, and hemiplegia on the opposite side, example right side, it is a pontine lesion. If 9, 10, 11, 12 cranial nerves are affected on one side and hemiplegia on the opposite side, the lesion is in the medulla oblongata. So ipsilateral cranial nerve palsy with contralateral hemiplegia, the lesion has to be in the brainstem. Cerebellar disorders. Cerebellar disorders, obviously you will have all the cerebellar manifestations, the nystagmus, finger nose incoordination, dysdiadochokinesia, hypotonia, pendular knee jerk, ataxic gait. But one important concept and point regarding cerebellar disorder is that the cerebellar manifestations are on the same side of cerebellar lesions. Unlike cortex, for example, if left side cortex is affected, the clinical manifestations on the right side, that is right hemiplegia, because corticospinal tract crosses at the level of the medulla oblongata and goes to the opposite side. So if the cerebral cortex is affected, the clinical manifestations are on the opposite side. But if cerebellum gets affected, the clinical manifestations are on the same side. Why? Example, if right cerebellum gets affected, the information passes from the right cerebellum, that is dentate, rubro, red nucleus, thalamus to the opposite side and cortex. Dentato, rubro, thalamo, cortex. So from right side cerebellum, the information goes to the left side cortex. But finally, all movements have to take place in the corticospinal tract, and therefore the corticospinal tract descends from the left cortex at the level of the medulla oblongata, it crosses over to the opposite side, to the right side, and descends. So because of this double crossing, dentato, rubro, thalamo, cortical tract to the opposite side, from the opposite side, corticospinal tract crossing at the level medulla oblongata to the opposite side, that means to the same side. Because of this double crossing, the cerebellar manifestations are on the same side because of double crossing. Right. Then the lesion can be in the spinal cord, what we call it as myelopathy. So when there's a spinal cord lesion, it's a very small cross-sectional area. So small lesion can produce dense deficits. So if there's a lesion in the spinal cord myelopathy, the motor, sensory, sphincter and sexual disturbances are present below the lesion. So if it is myelopathy, motor, sensory and sexual and sphincter disturbances are present below the lesion. But below the lesion, here again there's one important concept. There could be a false sensory localizing sign. Because the spinothalamic tract ascends and crosses one or two segments above, and since the sacral fibers lie laterally, anything coming from even the cervical region, anything coming and compressing the fibers, the sacral fibers may get compressed first, and therefore the sacral sensory loss may be there, or a few segments below it may be there, and therefore we may misinterpret that the lesion is below. In fact, you have to image higher up. So there could be false sensory localizing sign, especially because of spinal thalamic tracts. Right. Then from the spinal cord, you have the sensory nuclei, that is the dorsal root nuclei or the anterior horn cell, the motor part. So selectively anterior horn cells can get affected. Example, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or selectively dorsal root ganglia can get affected. Example, paraneoplastic disorders. So if anterior horn cell gets affected, like fasciculations, or dorsal root ganglia gets affected, you have a severe pain and sensory loss. You have to suspect paraneoplastic syndrome, you have to suspect dorsal root ganglia. This is neuronopathy. Then as they come, they become radicals, dorsal root and the ventral root. So if dorsal root or ventral root gets affected, you call that as radiculopathy. The common causes giving rise to radiculopathy are disc prolapse or spondylosis. The dorsal radiculopathy and the ventral radiculopathy. If there's a ventral radiculopathy, there will be loss of reflexes, there will be weakness. If it is a dorsal radiculopathy, there will be severe pain in the distribution of the dermatome. So if a person increases the intraspinal pressure like coughing, sneezing, Valsalva manual, the pain still increases. In fact, pain increasing on an increased pressure in the spinal column is very characteristic of a radiculopathy, dorsal radiculopathy. Right. Then we can have plexopathies. These join the dorsal root, ventral root join, and they form plexus. Example, brachial plexus in the neck and the lumbosacral plexus. The brachial plexopathy is more common than the lumbosacral plexopathy. Why? Because the brachial plexus is between two movable structures, the neck and the hand. Because it is fixed between two movable structures, the brachial plexopathy is more common than the lumbosacral plexopathies. And second thing, they are superficial, so easily they can get traumatized. So lumbosacral plexus are placed deep, and there is no before or after parts which are movable, like neck and hand in the brachial plexus, and therefore brachial plexopathies are more common than the lumbosacral plexopathies. Diabetes mellitus, neoplasia, or neuralgic amyotrophies can affect these plexus. So depending upon the motor, sensory getting affected and reflexes, you can place the lesion, which particular part of the plexus is affected. Right. Peripheral neuropathy. So once they form plexus, then they become peripheral nerves. The classic clinical manifestations are they'll have distal muscle weakness, whereas in myopathy you have proximal muscle weakness, exception being the myotonic dystrophy where the distal muscles get affected. But by and large, myopathies affect proximal muscles, neuropathies affect the distal muscles, exceptions being in neuropathy also like Guillain-Barré syndrome because it is a demyelinating neuropathy, length independent neuropathy, so distal and proximal muscles can get affected. But by and large, peripheral neuropathy affects distal muscles and myopathy affects proximal muscles. So in peripheral neuropathy, there is distal weakness and axonal is length dependent, so they'll have graded sensory loss. The distal most part, foot, may get severely affected, followed by little loss in knee, and then thigh may be almost normal. So it's a graded sensory loss, and obviously they'll have absence of deep tendon reflexes. The usual causes for peripheral neuropathy are diabetes. Always think of diabetes when a person comes with peripheral neuropathy. Diabetes, alcoholism, and Guillain-Barré syndrome are the usual causes. When we approach a case of neuropathy, very important point is to distinguish whether it is an axonal neuropathy or demyelinating neuropathy, because the prognosis is going to become different. In demyelinating neuropathy, example Guillain-Barré syndrome, the prognosis is better. It comes off fast, it recedes fast. When you give treatment, the recovery is still faster. Whereas axonal neuropathy is slow to start and there's not much improvement. So once you approach a case of peripheral neuropathy, you need to distinguish whether it's a demyelinating neuropathy where the myelins and the Schwann cell gets affected, or axonal neuropathy where the nerve cell body gets affected. So axonal neuropathy is length dependent. Since it's length dependent, the distal parts gets affected more. The glove and stocking type of sensory loss. In fact, one important clinical concept regarding the sensory loss in neuropathy is that when the sensory loss comes from foot to up to the level of the knee, once it touches the knee, the hands also should get affected because it's length dependent neuropathy. So in axonal neuropathy, which is a length-dependent neuropathy, when there is a sensory loss, the moment sensory loss comes from the foot up to the level of knee, the moment it touches the knee, the hands should start getting affected. So there will be weakness, there will be loss of reflexes, there is graded sensory loss. As I said, axonal neuropathy, they are insidious, slow in onset, slow in progression, whereas demyelinating neuropathy, they come off rapidly and they rapidly recover. When we do lumbar puncture, there is normal CSF protein axonal neuropathy, whereas in demyelinative disease, the proteins are elevated. In fact, in Guillain-Barré syndrome, there is albuminocytological dissociation. Proteins are very much elevated, but cells may be zero because it's a demyelinative autoimmune process. There is no infection here, so there is no increased cells. So when we do nerve conduction studies, axonal neuropathy, the amplitudes are decreased. Here the conduction velocity is decreased and latencies are prolonged. Axonal neuropathy, it's a bad prognosis. Demyelinating neuropathy, example Guillain-Barré syndrome, the prognosis is very good. So the next place where there could be a lesion after the nerve, it is the neuromuscular junction. Classic example is myasthenia gravis. Here they have a characteristic history, the fatigability, and the fatigability starts increasing as the time, with the passage of the time. So morning they are better, but afternoon they're slightly worse. Evening they are far worse. So with the passage of the time, the fatigability starts increasing. So easy fatigue, one of the characteristic findings of myasthenia gravis, they'll have ptosis and diplopia, but pupils are normal because myasthenia gravis is a neuromuscular junction disorder of skeletal muscles, not smooth muscles. Pupil is a smooth muscle, and therefore myasthenia gravis, which is a neuromuscular junction of skeletal disorder, skeletal muscles, will not affect pupils. So pupils will be normal in myasthenia gravis, in a neuromuscular junction disorder. And then not only the eye muscles, not only ptosis and diplopia, the bulbar muscles also can get affected. So they'll have dysphagia, dysarthria, and nasal regurgitation. Yeah. Then we come to the muscles. As I said in the early part of my discussion, muscles, myopathy usually affects the proximal muscles. So they'll have difficulty in getting up from squatting position. They have difficulty in climbing up the stairs. So they'll have symmetrical proximal weakness. They have Gover's sign, example Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, where the proximal muscles get affected. They cannot get up from squatting to the standing position. In fact, they climb on themselves like this and get up. This is known as the Gover's sign. And when the gluteus medius muscles get affected, which fixes the pelvis, when they walk like a duck. So it's known as waddling gait. So if you see waddling gait, gluteus medius, the abductor muscle getting affected, or Gover's sign where they climb up on themselves, it is a myopathy. So symmetrical proximal muscle weakness, the exceptions are the myotonic dystrophy, which affects the distal muscles. Then there's a characteristic unique pattern wherein not just the proximal muscles or the distal muscles affected, there's a combination wherein they can have proximal muscle weakness of the lower limb but distal muscle weakness of the upper limbs. We characteristically see this kind of a unique distribution in a disorder known as inclusion body myositis, where the proximal muscles of the lower limb, that is quadriceps, gets affected. Here the wrist and finger flexors get affected. So if we see weakness in wrist and finger flexors of the upper limb and quadriceps of the lower limb, it is usually inclusion body myositis. Then I said these are the areas where a particular lesion can be seen, anatomic diagnosis. But there are few diseases which affects more than one part of these systems, which you call as multifocal. I can give two classic examples. One is the neuromyelitis optica, NMO, which affects both the spinal cord and the optic nerve. So these are multifocal disorders. It can affect many systems. So neuromyelitis optica can affect the optic nerve and spinal cord. Second is the ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It not only affects the upper motor neurons, but it can affect even the lower motor neurons. So there could be a combination of upper motor neurons and lower motor neuron clinical manifestations. For example, they can have fasciculations, severe atrophy of the muscles. But the same muscles, when you try to elicit the deep tendon jerks, there could be brisk reflexes. So brisk reflexes with atrophy of the muscles and fasciculations involving both the systems, upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron, it is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, multifocal. Then only meninges can get affected. So when the meninges get affected, the classic finding is severe headache. I told in a separate lecture on headache, the entire brain is insensitive to pain. You cut brain, there is no pain. But the meninges and the vessels on the meningeal layers are highly sensitive to pain. So if meninges is affected, if the lesion is in the meninges, meningitis, or there's a meningeal inflammation, there will be severe headache. Classic example is meningitis and subarachnoid hemorrhage. Why we have severe headache in subarachnoid hemorrhage? We generally don't have headache in hemorrhage if it is it's a brain pathology, intracerebral pathology. But subarachnoid hemorrhage, we have severe pain, severe headache, thunderbolt headache. Why? Because it affects the meninges. The blood seeps underneath the arachnoid membrane. So anything which irritates the meninges, there will be severe headache, severe pain. So meningitis, subarachnoid hemorrhage, if it affects the meninges, there will be severe pain and headache. So meninges. Next is ventricles. The lesion could be in the ventricles when they can have raised intracranial pressure, hydrocephalus. So when there is raised intracranial pressure, what we see is that person becomes drowsy. The conscious level goes down. So they will have drowsiness, and then when the intracranial pressure increases so much so that there could be herniation, there could be a compression of the vessels supplying the brain, so hypoxemic encephalopathy. When there is a raised intracranial pressure, since the bone, overlying bone, will not allow the brain to expand, whatever orifices are, the brain slips into the orifices because of the increased pressure, and since the brain cannot be expanded because of the overlying skull, rigid skull. Unlike in the abdomen where there is no overlying bone, that's why we take the CSF and put it in the peritoneum as a form of treatment, ventriculoperitoneal shunt. So when there is a raised intracranial pressure, when the ventricles get affected, hydrocephalus, when there is raised intracranial pressure, since the brain cannot expand because of the overlying rigid skull, rigid bone, the brain goes through the hernial orifices, what we call as herniation. For example, if there is temporal lobe herniation, uncal herniation, the parasympathetic fibers which run on the third nerve gets affected, there will be pupillary dilatation on one side, the other pupil is normal. So if you find asymmetrical pupil, anisocoria, with signs of, with other signs of ventricles being affected or raised intracranial tension, you have to suspect uncal herniation. One side pupil will be dilated, the other side pupil is normal, known as Hutchinson pupil. Or because the brain is going and the pressure is getting increased, it can go and constrict the vessels. For example, posterior cerebral artery may get affected, they can have occipital lobe infarction. But usually two parts of the brain are particularly vulnerable to ischemia. One is hippocampus, and therefore they can have problems with memory. And second thing is cerebellum, they can have cerebellar signs. Or the pressure can increase so much so that it can go and compress the posterior cerebral artery, they can have occipital lobe infarctions. Alright. And then commonly, this is with raised intracranial pressure, but when the ventricles are elevated and the pressure is normal, like normal pressure hydrocephalus, that is the absorption and the production are almost equal, and there is normal pressure in the normal pressure hydrocephalus, the frontal lawns of the lateral ventricle get enlarged and it impinges on the medial part of the frontal lobe. In the medial part of the frontal lobe, you have the leg area, so they have gait apraxia. The bladder center is there, so you can have incontinence of the urine. Frontal lobe is responsible for immediate memory, they can have dementia. So dementia, incontinence of urine and gait problems, you have to suspect normal pressure hydrocephalus. And then the skin can get affected. Usually the nervous system you always check out on the skin. Why? In fact, very important when you take history is that to ask and check out for neurocutaneous markers like Ashleigh spots or Kefele spots. Why we check out on the skin in a nervous disorder? Why are these neurocutaneous markers very important? The reason being, the nervous system and skin originate from the ectoderm. Since both originate from ectoderm, the lesions in the nervous system can be manifested on the skin. So we always have to check out on the neurocutaneous markers in a suspected neurological disorder, because nervous system and the skin originate from ectoderm. Then we have to look out for the skull and the spine. During the during the fetal process, embryological process, the anterior pore and the posterior pore are there. They generally close around 25 plus days, plus or minus days. So when the anterior pore does not close, you can have the brain coming out, not the proximal parts are not well developed, you can have anencephaly. If the posterior pore does not close by the specified day, then the dorsal elements of the nervous system may not develop well. We can have spina bifida. So anencephaly because of the improper or non-closure of the anterior pore, and spina bifida because of the non-closure or improper closure of the posterior pore during our fetal stage. So we can to some extent rectify it in probably future pregnancies by giving folic acid, and usually it is seen in person taking antiepileptic drugs, especially sodium valproate. So sodium valproate is a dreaded antiepileptic drug in a pregnant woman because it can cause neural tube defects because of folic acid deficiency. Yeah, and then again we have to always look at the spine for kyphoscoliosis or foot anomalies or abnormalities of the foot, of the bone. You can have high arched foot or you can have high kyphoscoliosis. Usually you see these bony abnormalities of the spine and the foot in a long-standing neuropathy because of the unequal weakness of muscles. Unequal weakness of paravertebral muscles will cause kyphoscoliosis, or unequal weakness of the foot muscles will cause high arched foot. And therefore these are seen in chronic neuropathies of long-standing duration, especially Charcot-Marie tooth disease or hereditary neuropathies. So, neurologic history taking, where is the lesion, anatomical diagnosis. So if we go in a methodical step-by-step order, and if we ask these pertinent questions and examine in a systematic way, we can place the lesion, we can find out where the lesion is, the anatomical diagnosis. So I hope you have enjoyed listening to my lecture. I really enjoyed giving the lecture. If you have any comments, you can post on my YouTube channel or you can give suggestions. If you have liked my channel, liked my class, please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, Dr. Srinivas Medical Concepts, and my FB page, Dr. Srinivas Concepts. Thank you. Bye.